This video is entitled Two Needs. It answers a question: what does learning Bible stories do for me? Why should I do it? Why should I get involved in encouraging other people to do it? Well, let's join the live audience and deal with two needs. There are two needs. Bible telling fulfills two needs. Why do we learn chapters of the Bible this way? Why do we take the time to learn these stories? Well, the first need that it fulfills is that it impacts decision-making skills. It impacts decision-making skills. We were experimenting with this thing, and that's one of the reasons that we first went into prisons, was to experiment. We had to pull together some people who were notoriously making bad decisions and finding out how does it affect them. At this point in the training, we gave several illustrations of how Bible telling is being used in the various prisons that we're in. Now, generally, the wardens that have us come in want us to equip the inmates that they have that are assisting their chaplains in reaching the general prison population. And of course, we are glad to do that. That's one of the advantages. But in one prison, the warden gave us a cross-section of the entire prison. We had people that were involved in ministry, those people that didn't go to church at all. We had people of all different faiths, of different religions. We even had people that were troublemakers and those who were on drugs just to keep them from being violent. Oh, this warden could not have done us a bigger favor. We were able to see firsthand on how learning Bible stories affects decision-making skills. The warden joked with us saying, it's hard to maintain your reputation as a troublemaker when you're out in the yard telling Bible stories. It had a tremendous impact on these people. But it's not just people in prison. We've been able to experiment with people outside the prisons of all different social status. The highly educated to those who have no education, those who couldn't read to those who were fanatical about reading all the time. It did affect doctrine and theology, but the main thing it affected is the ability for the person to make good decisions. Well, let's once again join our live audience. When you have a decision, back in my day, when Bible stories were a little bit more common in society, you just naturally asked yourself, well, I wonder what Joseph would do in a case like this. I wonder what Daniel would do in a case like this. I wonder what, and these stories would be there, and it would be a way of evaluating our decisions based upon what we learned from the stories of the Bible. Now, what we have today is that we have churches that are full of people with good doctrine and good theology, but they don't know the stories. So they have all this good doctrine and theology making bad decisions. And there's hardly any difference between those who are in the church and those who are outside of the church, because they're all making bad decisions. So that's the one thing. We need to have a resurgence of people knowing these stories. The other thing that it does for us, the other need that it fulfills, it impacts you for greater ministry. It impacts you for greater ministry. It's an equipping. Having these stories equips you. You say, oh, well, I don't plan to do children's church. Well, obviously, if you have children's church, it'll equip you for that. Well, I don't teach Sunday school class. Well, obviously, it will equip you if you teach Sunday school class, but it does more. What happens, and everyone that learns these stories, it's a saying, you don't have to learn very many before this happens. As you're at the office, or you're at the shop, or you're at at your Rotary meeting, or you're visiting with a neighbor, and a situation comes in, and a story pops right in your mind, and you say, "Well, that reminds me of a story," or that there was a time in the Bible, and it just flows out. It just flows out, and Phyllis and I were talking about that. Remember, I mean, you're in a different Bible study, and all of a sudden a story just pops in your mind. And I've had people that only knew about 5 stories, and it's funny, the old saying is that if you own a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. If you have 5 stories, it's just amazing how many things they fit into. After a while, I need to learn some more stories here. I'm getting tired of using the very same ones for every situation in life. And as when I was in Egypt, they had I did a 4-day workshop with pastors from around that section of Egypt. And afterwards, then they started taking me around from place to place. I'd be going to the various churches, and they had me do a story sermon at each church. Well, in between traveling from here to there, they would stop at several places. And these places were like a funeral or a wedding or an old saint in the town that was revered, or just on and on, a Christian businessman. I mean, just all these things, a family that was going through some difficulty, a wayward son. And they would take me there, and then after we got done with the social time, they'd turn to me and say, "Now, John, does this remind you of a story?" Well, of course it does. Everything reminds me of a story, well, tell us that story. So I would tell the story. It was the first time I did that. Which story did you want to hear? Because they would just, does it remind, well, every time it reminded me of a different story, so I would tell that story. I had not, in all my life, I've never told that many Bible stories in a short amount of time. Because every situation they brought me to, and it was like they had a guru that they were taking around in that part of Egypt. But that challenged more people. More people. There was one guy who, his brothers were pastors, his sister was married to a pastor, and he was considered the black sheep of the family because he just had a job somewhere. And he didn't feel it. But he says, "I can do that. I can do that." And he said, "I'm going to learn those stories, and I'm going to be the one that will go around and share God's word that way." It equips you. Learning the stories equips you for ministry. It equips you to be a help, to be there, to be that person that will represent God's word in many situations. So, there you have 2 great reasons why we should put a concentrated focus on learning Bible stories. Come back next session when we will continue on with seminars, Bible telling seminars.